The space station known as Crucible Prime hung in the darkness between three dying stars. A massive ring of metal and light that stretched so wide it could be seen from half a system away. It was the most famous place in the Galactic Accord, not because of its size or its beauty, but because of what happened inside it. The Arena of Ascension. Every cycle, warriors from across the galaxy came to this station to fight, to bleed, and to prove that their species was the strongest in the known universe. Commander Vyra Selkath stood at the viewport of her warship and watched the station grow larger as they approached, and she felt the familiar heat of battle hunger rising in her chest. She was Draelith, 7 feet of scaled muscle and predator instinct, with claws that could cut through starship armor, and eyes that glowed like molten copper in the dim light of the bridge. Her people were born hunters, raised from the egg to fight, to dominate, to stand at the top of the food chain on every world they walked upon. And Vyra was the best of them. She had never lost a fight, not in the border wars, not in the pirate campaigns, not in the arena itself, where she had claimed victory 3 times before. She was the youngest fleet commander the Draelith Dominion had ever produced, and she intended to remind the galaxy exactly why. "Commander," said Tolek from behind her, his deep voice rumbling like stone grinding against stone. She turned to look at her second-in-command, a Gorvon, massive and gray-skinned, with 4 thick arms crossed over a chest that looked like it had been carved from a mountain. "The docking authority has granted us Bay 14, he said. "Good," Vyra replied, her tail flicking once behind her, a sign of anticipation that she did not bother to hide. "Let us go remind these lesser species what a real warrior looks like." Tolek said nothing to that, but his lower left hand tightened slightly, the way it always did when he disagreed but chose not to speak. Crucible Prime was alive, with noise and color and the smell of 1,000 different species, all crammed into the same corridors. Vyra moved through the crowd like a blade, her retinue of Draelith soldiers flanking her on both sides, and the crowd parted before her the way small creatures always parted before something with claws and teeth. She liked that. She liked the way the smaller beings flinched, the way they stepped back, the way their eyes dropped to the floor when she passed. This was the natural order, the strong above, the weak below. In the main concourse, massive display screens showed the faces of this cycle's competitors, and Vyra paused to look up at her own image, pleased with the way the light caught the ridges of her skull and the sharp edges of her jaw. "Impressive, is it not?" she said to Tolek. "You are a formidable warrior, Commander." Agreed, though his tone was flat and careful in the way it always was when she sought compliments. It was then that she noticed the other names on the display. Warriors from a 12 species, each one a champion of their world. And at the very bottom of the list, almost as an afterthought, a name she did not recognize. Eric Stone, human, unaffiliated. Vyra let out a sharp bark of laughter that made 2 passing Chivari merchants scatter in alarm. "A human?" she said, her voice carrying across the concourse. "They let a human into the Arena of Ascension?" She had heard of humans, of course. Everyone in the Accord had heard of them by now. They were a young species, barely 40 years in the galactic community. Soft-skinned and fragile-looking, with no claws, no scales, no venom, no natural armor of any kind, and yet somehow they had built a reputation that made older, stronger species nervous. Vyra thought it was pathetic. Won their wars through stubbornness, through refusing to die when any sensible creature would have stopped fighting long ago. They called it endurance. Vyra called it the survival strategy of prey animals too stupid to know they had already lost. "Come," she said to Tolek. "I want to see this station's cantina before I register for the bracket, and perhaps we will find this human warrior and see what all the fuss is about." The cantina was a vast, loud space filled with smoke and music and the sound of dozens of languages being spoken and shouted and growled all at once. Vyra found a table near the center. She always preferred to be seen, and ordered a Dralith combat brew that made the server's hands tremble as they poured it. She was halfway through her drink when she noticed the human. He sat alone at a small table near the wall, quiet and still in a way that seemed almost unnatural in the chaos of the cantina. Expected. He was average in size for a human male, shorter than her by more than a foot, with none of the bulk that some of the larger galactic species carried. He had dark hair cut short, calm gray eyes, and weathered hands that rested loosely around a simple glass of water. There was a faded scar running from his jaw to his collarbone, but other than that, there was nothing remarkable about him at all. He looked like a merchant, or a mechanic, or someone's quiet uncle who had wandered into the wrong station. As Vyra watched, a group of Kreth, ugly, thick-necked brutes who made their living as enforcers and thugs, surrounded a small Pelori trader at a nearby table, knocking his drink to the floor and grabbing at the satchel he carried. The Pelori squeaked in terror, his tiny body shaking. And the human stood up. He did not rush, he did not shout, he did not reach for a weapon. He simply walked over, placed himself between the Kreth and the Pelori, and spoke in a voice so calm and quiet that Vyra had to strain her enhanced hearing to catch the words. "I think you have made your point," the human said. "He understands. Why not let him go, and I will buy your table a round of whatever you are drinking." The lead Kreth stared down at the human with open confusion. Here was a creature half his size, with no visible weapon, no armor, no backup, standing in his path, and smiling as if they were old friends. Something in the Kreth's tiny brain must have flickered, because after a long, tense moment, he grunted and stepped back, dragging his crew to the bar, where the human was already signaling the server. The Pelori fled, clutching his satchel, and the human returned to his table and his water as if nothing had happened. Vyra watched all of this with a curling lip and a rising sense of contempt. This was humanity's great contribution to the galaxy, a soft little creature who solved problems by buying drinks for thugs. She stood and walked to his table, her shadow falling over him like a storm cloud over a small hill. "You are the human entered in the arena," she said. It was not a question. He looked up at her, and his gray eyes held no fear, no tension, no challenge. "I am," he said simply. "I am Commander Vyra Selkath of the Dralith Dominion, 3-time champion of the Arena of Ascension, undefeated in 47 sanctioned combat engagements." "That is very impressive," he said, and there was no mockery in his voice, just a quiet, honest acknowledgement that somehow made it worse. "I hope we are matched in the bracket, human," she said, leaning close enough that he could see every one of her teeth. "It has been a long time since I had a fight that ended before I could break a sweat." He looked at her for a moment, and something moved behind those calm gray eyes, something quick and deep that she could not read. "Your left side when you shift your weight," he said quietly. "You should fix that before the tournament begins." Then he smiled, picked up his glass, and walked away. Vyra stood there, her claws digging grooves into the table, her copper eyes burning with a fury she had not felt in years. Behind her, Tolek sighed very quietly. Later that night, after Vyra had retired to her quarters, a small figure with clicking legs and compound eyes that shimmered like oil on water approached Tolek in the corridor. "You are the Gorvan who serves the Dralith commander, yes?" asked Lyrae, the Chivari information broker, her voice a rapid series of clicks translated through her collar device. "I am," said Tolek. "I have a warning for your commander. If she draws the human in the arena bracket, she must withdraw the challenge." Tolek frowned, his heavy brow lowering over his deep-set eyes. Why would she do that? Lyrae's antenna twitched, and her compound eyes caught the corridor light in a way that made them look almost sad. "Because I like her," Lyrae said softly, "and I would rather she not die." Then she was gone, clicking away into the shadows, and Tolek stood alone in the corridor, with the sound of her warning ringing in all four of his ears. The bracket was drawn the next morning, in front of a crowd so large that the main concourse of Crucible Prime could barely hold them all. Thousands of beings from dozens of species pressed together shoulder to shoulder and tentacle to claw, watching as the arena's master of ceremonies, a tall, silver-skinned Veilori with a voice that could shake walls, called out the names and the matchups one by one. Vyra stood with her arms crossed, her tail perfectly still, her copper eyes locked on the massive display screen above the stage. She did not care who she fought in the early rounds. They were all the same to her, stepping stones on the path to another championship that would echo through the stars. And then the Veilori announcer spoke the words she had been waiting to hear. Semi-final bracket, Commander Vyra Selkath of the Draelith Dominion versus Eric Stone, human, unaffiliated. The crowd erupted into noise, shouts and growls, and the clicking of mandibles and the hissing of species that had no other way to express surprise. Vyra smiled, and it was the kind of smile that showed every single one of her razor-sharp teeth. "Perfect," she whispered. Beside her, Tolek shifted his massive weight from one foot to the other, and his lower hands clenched into fists the size of boulders. He had not told Vyra about Lyrae's warning yet, or rather, he had tried, and she had cut him off before he could finish. "I do not need the advice of an insect broker to know my own strength," she had said, and that had been the end of it. Now he watched the bracket screen with an unease that sat heavy in his stone-carved gut, and he wondered if the little Kavari knew something that the rest of them did not. The days before the semi-final match became a spectacle all on their own. Vyra trained in the arena's public practice halls, and she made sure that everyone could see her do it. She moved with the speed that had made the Draelith the most feared close combat species in the Accord. Lunges so fast that the training drones could not track her. Claw strikes that cut through reinforced targets like they were made of wet paper. And a predator's focus that never wavered, never blinked, never looked away from the kill. Crowds gathered every day to watch her, and the betting boards across the station updated in real time. The odds sat at 40-1 in Vyra's favor, and no one who watched her train thought that was unreasonable. Eric Stone, meanwhile, did nothing, or at least nothing that anyone could see. He was spotted walking through the station's small garden dome, where a handful of alien plants grew under artificial sunlight, his hands in his pockets and his face turned upward, as if he were enjoying the warmth. He was seen sitting at a food stall in the lower market, eating a bowl of noodles with the slow and careful attention of a man who had nowhere else to be. He was found on an observation deck, reading something on a battered datapad, his legs stretched out in front of him, like a tourist on vacation. He did not train, or if he did, no one saw it. He did not boast, he did not give interviews, he did not even seem to acknowledge that he was about to fight the most dangerous warrior the Draelith had ever produced. The station's media feeds were full of jokes about the matchup. The apex predator and the noodle merchant, the dragon and the mouse, the champion and the dead man walking. Vyra saw the jokes and laughed at them, because they confirmed what she already believed. Humans were soft, humans were slow, humans were nothing. She found Eric again 2 days before the match, sitting alone at the same cantina table with the same glass of water, and she decided to give him one last chance to feel the weight of what was coming. She walked to his table and placed both clawed hands flat on the surface, leaning over him until her shadow swallowed him whole. "Do you know what I am going to do to you in that ring, human?" she asked, her voice low and thick with threat. Eric looked up at her with those calm gray eyes, and said nothing for a moment. Then he tilted his head slightly, just a small movement, barely noticeable, and his gaze traveled down from her face to her shoulders, across her arms, down to her feet, and back up again. It was not the look of a frightened man studying a predator. It was the look of someone reading a blueprint. "You have increased your training intensity," he said quietly. "Your left shoulder is sitting half an inch higher than your right. You are compensating for a minor strain in your lateral muscle group, probably from the claw drills you have been doing in the public hall." Vira went very still. "You should rest it before the match," he continued, his voice gentle and almost kind. "That will slow your crossbody strike by about 8%. And in a real fight, 8% is the difference between landing a hit and missing by a mile." The silence at the table stretched out like a wire pulled tight enough to sing. Vira's claws had carved deep lines into the metal surface of the table without her even realizing it, and her breath came in short, heated bursts through her nostrils. A prey species had just analyzed her body, identified a weakness she had not even noticed herself, and offered her advice on how to fix it. The insult was so enormous that it circled all the way back around to something she could not even name. She turned and walked away without a word, because if she stayed 1 second longer, she was going to kill him right there in the cantina and rob herself of the pleasure of doing it in front of 200,000 screaming spectators. Tolek caught up with her in the corridor, his heavy footsteps shaking the floor. "Plates, plates. Commander, I need to tell you something. The Shivari broker, Lyrae, she came to me with a warning about the human." "I do not care," Vira snarled. "She said he is dangerous. She said you should withdraw." "An insect's paranoia," Vira spat. "The human is a merchant who reads datapads and eats noodles. I will break him in half, and the galaxy will remember why the Draelith bow to no one." Tolek opened his mouth to say more, but the look in her eyes told him that the conversation was over, and so he closed it again and followed her in silence. What neither of them knew, what no one on the station knew, except for one small Kivari with compound eyes and access to databases she was never supposed to touch, was what Eric Stone did that night. Deep in the lower levels of Crucible Prime, in an empty cargo bay where the lights had been dimmed to almost nothing, Eric stood alone in the dark. He was still for a long time. So still that the end. Cargo bay's motion sensors deactivated, deciding that there was nothing alive in the room. And then he moved. It started slow, almost like a dance, a shift of weight, a turn of the hips, a hand rising and falling in a pattern that seemed simple, until you looked closer and realized that every motion flowed into the next with a precision that was almost mechanical. Then it got faster. His body became a blur of controlled violence. Strikes and blocks and counters performed at a speed that should not have been possible for a species with no natural enhancements. No genetic modifications, no cybernetic implants. Every movement was economical. Every strike aimed at a point that would end a fight instantly. Throat, temple, nerve cluster, joint, spine. There was no wasted energy, no showmanship, no sound except the whisper of air being cut by hands that had done this 10,000 times before. A small cleaning drone, hovering near the ceiling, captured 3 seconds of footage before Eric's hand snapped up and disabled it with a single precise throw of a bolt he had picked up from the floor without breaking his rhythm. The drone went dark and clattered to the ground. Eric stood still again, breathing slowly, his gray eyes reflecting the faint emergency lighting like 2 small moons in the darkness. Somewhere in the station above him, 200,000 beings slept and laughed, and placed their bets, and prepared for a show. None of them had any idea what was standing beneath them in the dark. Lyrae found the drone an hour later. She pulled the memory chip with her delicate mandibles, and played the 3 seconds of footage on a private screen in her quarters. And her compound eyes, all 6 of them, went wide in a way that her species only did when they encountered something that triggered their deepest survival instincts. She had seen movement like that before, not in person, but in classified war footage that she had stolen from a Galactic Accord military server 2 years ago. Footage of Void Wardens in combat. She contacted Tolek on an encrypted channel, and this time her clicking voice was sharp and urgent in a way it had not been before. "Listen to me very carefully, Gorvan. Get your commander out of that ring." "She will not listen to me," Tolek said heavily. "Then she needs to know what she is walking into. That man is not a merchant. He is not a civilian. He is not what he pretends to be." "Then what is he?" Lorray was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, Tolek could hear the soft whirring of her wings, a stress response that Shivari could not control. "I do not know yet," she said, "but I am going to find out before that match begins. And Tolek, if I am right about what I think I am right about, then your commander is not walking into a fight." The Arena of Ascension was a coliseum built for gods. It sat at the heart of Crucible Prime like a steel cathedral, rising from the station's core, in layers of reinforced transparasteel and energy shielding that could contain a small nuclear detonation. 200,000 seats surrounded the fighting floor in a bowl that climbed upward into the haze of station lights, and on this day, every single seat was filled. The noise was beyond anything that could be described in words. It was a living thing, a wall of sound, made up of roars and screams and clicks and hisses, and the deep thrumming vibration of species that communicated through frequencies most ears could not even detect. Display screens the size of buildings showed the fighters' names and species and combat records, and the betting boards flickered with numbers that changed so fast they looked like waterfalls of light. The odds had not changed, 40-1 in favor of Commander Vira Selkath. No serious bettor in the galaxy would put money on a human civilian against a 3-time Dralith champion. And the only wagers on Eric Stone came from humans scattered across the audience, who bet with their hearts rather than their heads. The Veilori announcer's voice rolled across the arena like thunder, silencing the crowd one section at a time. In the Eastern Gate, 3-time champion of the Arena of Ascension, undefeated in 47 sanctioned engagements, the pride of the Dralith Dominion, Commander Vira Selkath. The Eastern Gate opened, and Vira walked out into the light. She was magnificent. Her scales had been polished to a mirror shine, and they caught the arena's lights and threw them back in flashes of copper and gold. She wore the traditional Dralith combat harness, minimal armor that left her claws and tail free, designed not for protection, but for display, because a true Dralith warrior did not need it. Protection, she moved with the liquid grace of a predator who had never known what it meant to be prey. And the crowd responded with a sound that shook the very bones of the station. Vira raised her clawed hand, and the noise doubled, tripled, became something that could be felt in the chest and the teeth. She was in her element, and she was glorious. In the Western Gate, first-time entrant, unaffiliated, representing no world and no nation, Eric Stone, human. The Western Gate opened. Eric walked out in plain clothes. He wore a simple dark shirt, loose trousers, and flat-soled shoes that looked like they had been bought from a station market for less than the cost of a meal. He carried no weapons, wore no armor, had no war paint, or battle markings, or ceremonial anything. He looked like a man who had wandered in from the food court and could not find the exit. The crowd did not roar for him. They murmured, confused and amused. Somewhere in the upper sections, someone laughed loud enough for the sound to carry down to the arena floor. Eric did not seem to notice any of it. He walked to the center of the fighting floor with his hands at his sides and his shoulders loose. And he stopped and stood there, as if he were waiting for a bus. Vira studied him from across the ring, her copper eyes narrowing, her claws flexing open and closed at her sides, in the rhythmic pattern that meant a Dreolith was preparing to strike. She saw a small, soft-skinned creature with no natural weapons, no visible muscle mass worth noting, and calm gray eyes that looked back at her with an expression she could not read. This would be over quickly. The arena's combat AI spoke in a flat, neutral voice that carried no excitement and no bias. Fighters ready, combat begins on the signal. Standard rules apply. Match ends on submission, incapacitation, or death. 3, 2, 1, begin. Launched. Every being in the arena who had watched her train knew what was coming. The Dreolith opening lunge, a burst of explosive speed that covered 30 feet in under a second, claws leading, aimed at the throat in a strike that had ended fights before most opponents could blink. She was a blur of copper scales and killing intent, and the crowd surged to their feet because this was the moment. This was where it ended. Her claws sliced through the air where Eric's throat had been. He was not there. He had moved, not backward, not to the side in the way that most fighters dodged, but at an angle that should not have worked. A small, precise shift of weight and position that took him out of the path of her claws by less than 2 inches. Vyra's momentum carried her past him, and she spun with predator speed, already adjusting, already launching a second strike, a backhanded claw sweep aimed at his ribs. Eric leaned away from it. The way a tree bends in the wind, just enough, no more, and his eyes never left hers. The arena went quiet, not silent. There were still sounds, still breathing and rustling and the hum of the energy shields. But the roaring stopped as 200,000 beings began to realize that something was wrong with what they were seeing. Vyra attacked again, faster this time, a combination of strikes and slashes that she had used to tear through armored opponents twice the human size. Overhead claw, spinning tail sweep, lunging bite, crossbody slash. Eric avoided all of it. He did not block, he did not parry, he did not fight back. He simply was not where her attacks landed, moving with a timing so precise that it looked like he knew what she was going to do before she did it. Because he did. Every twitch of her muscle, every shift in her weight, every flicker of her copper eyes told him exactly what was coming next, and he read her body the way a scholar reads a book, calmly, thoroughly, and without any hurry at all. The crowd's murmur grew into something louder, something that sounded like the first edge of fear. Vyra felt it too, a cold sensation in her gut that she had never experienced before. Something that her predator brain screamed at her to recognize, but that her pride refused to name. She was missing. She was missing every single strike, and the human was not even breathing hard. Desperation is an ugly thing in a warrior, and it came to Vyra now like poison spreading through her blood. She reached deep inside herself and found the place where the Dreolith kept their oldest weapon, the berserker fury, the kill rage that turned a Dreolith warrior from a soldier into something closer to a natural disaster. Her scales flushed dark, almost black, and her pupils expanded until her eyes were nothing but pools of liquid copper fire. She screamed, a sound that activated the arenas. Acoustic dampeners, because it was at a frequency that could rupture the eardrums of most species present. And she charged with everything she had, holding nothing back, moving faster than she had ever moved in her life. A 7-foot wall of claws and teeth and ancient predator rage aimed at one small human standing alone on the arena floor. Eric's eyes changed. It was a small thing, so small that only Vyra, who was close enough to see the gray of his irises, could have noticed it. The warmth went out of them. The gentleness, the patience, the quiet calm that had defined every interaction she had ever had with this man, all of it vanished in a single heartbeat, replaced by something that was not anger, not fear, not excitement. It was certainty. The absolute, bone-deep certainty of a being who had faced things that would break the mind of every creature in this arena, and had not just survived them, but had ended them. Eric stepped forward, her charge, not away from it, And in that moment, Vyra understood with a clarity that turned her blood to ice that she had made a terrible mistake. He moved inside her guard, past her claws, past her teeth, so close that she could see the faded scar on his neck and the threads of silver in his dark hair. 3 strikes. 3 precise impacts to points on her body that she did not even know were vulnerable. Nerve clusters buried deep beneath her scales. Points that only someone who had studied Draelith anatomy at a level reserved for military combat specialists would know existed. Her legs stopped working first, then her arms. Then she was on the ground, fully conscious, fully aware, completely unable to move, staring up at the arena lights, while her brain tried to understand what had just happened. The arena was silent, truly silent now, the kind of silence that falls when 200,000 beings collectively stop breathing at the same time. 9 seconds. The entire fight, from the opening signal to Vyra's body hitting the floor, had lasted 9 seconds. Eric stood over her, and as she looked up at him with wide copper eyes that held the first real fear she had ever felt in her life, the warmth came back to his face, like sunlight returning after an eclipse. He knelt beside her, and his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Left side," he said, and there was no cruelty in the words, no mockery, just the same gentle tone he had used in the cantina. "I told you." Then he stood, turned, and walked toward the western gate. The crowd parted for him without being asked, Adi's pulling back from his path the way water pulls back from a stone, an instinct older than language, older than civilization, the deep and primal recognition that something dangerous was passing by. He did not raise his hand. He did not celebrate. He did not look back. He walked out of the arena of ascension as quietly as he had walked in, and 200,000 beings watched him go in a silence so complete that the only sound was the soft tap of his flat-soled shoes on the arena floor. In a private viewing box, high above the fighting floor, Lyrae the Chivari sat perfectly still, her compound eyes fixed on the footage she had just cross-referenced against classified Galactic Accord military databases that no civilian should ever have been able to access. The match rate was 97.4%. Her translator struggled with the word she whispered, because Chivari did not have a direct equivalent for it. The closest human translation was a name, a call sign, a ghost story that soldiers told each other in the dark. Vyra woke in the medical bay with the taste of copper on her tongue, and a silence in her mind that she had never experienced before. The silence of defeat. Her body had recovered. The nerve strikes had been temporary, designed to disable rather than destroy, and the station's medical systems had restored full function within hours. But something else had been broken, something that no medical drone could scan for or repair. She lay on the recovery bed and stared at the ceiling, and tried to understand what had happened to her in that arena. And every time she replayed it in her mind, it got worse. She had not been beaten. She had been dismantled. There was a difference, and she understood it now with a painful clarity that made her chest tight. Being beaten meant meeting a stronger force and losing. It was clean and honest, and it happened to every warrior eventually. Being dismantled meant that her opponent had understood her so deeply, her strengths and her weaknesses, that extracting her was surgical and final. Completely. Had read her so thoroughly, had known her body and her instincts and her weaknesses so perfectly, that the fight had never been a fight at all. It had been a demonstration. "Commander," said Tolek from the doorway, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "How are you feeling?" "Tell me," Vyra said without looking at him. "Tell me what the Chivari tried to warn you about." Tolek was quiet for a moment, and then he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "She said the human was not what he appeared to be. She said he was dangerous, that you should withdraw." And you tried to tell me. I did, and I did not listen. You did not. Vira closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, the pride that had always burned there like a furnace had dimmed to something smaller, not gone, but banked, like coals waiting for new fuel. Find the Chivari, she said. Bring her to me. I want to know who I fought. Lyrae came within the hour, clicking into the medical bay on her 6 delicate legs, with a datapad tucked under one of her middle arms, and an expression on her compound face that might have been sympathy if Chivari faces worked that way. You want to know who he is, Lyrae said. It was not a question. Yes. Lyrae set the datapad on the bed beside Vira and activated it, and the first thing that appeared on the screen was a Galactic Accord military file, stamped with so many classification markers that the text was almost invisible beneath them. The man you know as Eric Stone does not exist, Lyrae began, her clicks measured and careful. That identity is a ghost file, a military-grade fabrication created by the human branch of Galactic Accord Special Operations to provide a cover identity for an active Void Warden. Void Warden, Vira repeated, and the word tasted strange in her mouth, like something she had heard in a story long ago, but never expected to encounter in real life. The Void Wardens are humanity's most elite military order, Lyrae continued. They operate alone, deep in hostile territory, in situations where conventional forces have failed or cannot be deployed. They are the absolute last resort, the weapon that gets sent when everything else has been tried and everything else has been broken. Vira sat up slowly, her scales rippling with a tension she could not control. There are perhaps 30 active Void Wardens in the entire human military, Lyrae said. Their identities are classified at the highest levels of galactic command. Most species in the Accord do not even know they exist. And the human in the arena is one of them? Lyrae's antennae twitched, and she looked at Vira with all 6 of her compound eyes, in a way that made the Draelith commander feel very small. He is not just one of them. He is the one they tell stories about. She touched the datapad, and a call sign appeared on the screen. No face, no real name, no planet of origin. Just a single word that the Galactic Accord had assigned to their most classified and most lethal operative, Gravemaker. I do not know his real name, Lyrae admitted. No one does, or at least no one who would tell me. But I know what he has done, because even the best classification systems have cracks, and I am very good at finding cracks. She told Vira about the Vraxian siege. 11,000 Vraxian shock troops had taken a colony world hostage, dug in behind orbital defenses and ground shields that would have required a full fleet to break through. The Accord sent 1 Void Warden. 72 hours later, the siege was over. Not because the Vraxians surrendered, but because there were no Vraxians left. 1 human, alone, against 11,000 of the most brutal ground fighters in the galaxy, and when the Accord relief fleet finally arrived, they found the colony's civilian population, alive and unharmed, and a single human sitting on the steps of the governor's building, drinking water from a canteen. She told Vira about the Devourer Hive on Targus 9. A biological superorganism, a living, thinking mass of interconnected predatory cells that consumed everything organic in its path, had swallowed 3 colony outposts and was growing exponentially. The only way to kill it was to destroy the Queen Node buried a mile beneath the surface, deep inside the hive itself, surrounded by millions of defensive organisms, evolved specifically to kill anything that came close. Gravemaker walked in alone. He fought his way through a mile of living nightmare, reached the Queen Node, and destroyed it with improvised explosives built from materials he scavenged along the way. And when he walked out, covered in bioacid burns and barely conscious, he was carrying a wounded civilian child he had found alive inside the hive. Everyone had assumed was dead months ago. She told Vira about the Dead Corridor, a region of deep space where 14 warships from 6 different species had disappeared without a trace over the span of a decade. No distress signals, no wreckage, no survivors, nothing. The Accord declared it a no-travel zone and moved on, because whatever was in the dead corridor was something that no fleet, no matter how powerful, seemed able to fight. Gravemaker went in alone, in a single-person ship with minimal weapons. He came back 11 days later. Nothing else did. And when Galactic Command asked him what he found in the dead corridor, his report was 4 words long. Handled, do not return. Vyra listened to all of this in a silence that grew heavier with every word, and by the time Lorray finished, the Draelith commander was sitting on the edge of the medical bed, with her clawed hands gripping her knees so tightly that her scales creaked. "Let me live," she said, and the words came out hollow and strange. "Yes," Lorray said simply. "He could have killed me at any point during that fight. He could have killed you before the fight. He could have killed you in the cantina, in the corridor, in your sleep. A Void Warden at his level does not need an arena to end a life." "Then why did he hold back?" Lorray tilted her head, her antenna waving slowly. "That is not a question I can answer, but I think it is a question worth asking him." Vyra found Eric on Observation Deck 7, a quiet platform near the top of the station, where the transparisteel walls gave a clear view of the 3 dying stars that Crucible Prime orbited. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, watching the stars with the same quiet patience he brought to everything, and he did not turn when he heard her approach. She stopped a few feet behind him and stood there, and for the first time in her life, she did not know how to begin a conversation. She was not approaching him as a predator, not as a champion, not as a commander. She did not know what she was approaching him as, only that the old categories no longer fit. "You know who I am," Eric said without turning around. "Yes. The Chavari told you." "She did." He nodded slowly, still watching the stars. "She is very clever. I knew she would figure it out eventually, but I hoped it would be after I left the station." Vyra moved to stand beside him at the viewport, and the two of them stood there in silence for a long moment, the 7-foot Draelith warrior and the quiet human, side by side, watching ancient stars burn themselves to nothing. "Why?" Vyra asked, and the word carried the weight of every question she could not find the language for. Why the arena? Why hold back? Why let her live? Eric was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke, the mask of the gentle merchant was gone, not replaced by something harder, but by something older and more tired than she had expected. "I have been fighting since I was 17 years old," he said. "I have killed things that do not have names in any language you speak. I have walked into places that your species tells its children about to frighten them. And I have walked out again, carrying pieces of myself that I will never get back." He paused, and his gray eyes reflected the dying starlight in a way that made them look ancient. "I came here because I wanted to remember what it felt like to fight something clean, something honest. A warrior who fights for glory and for her people, not a monster that wants to eat a civilization." He looked at her then, and she saw in his eyes something that she had not expected to find. Not coldness, not the empty stare of a killer, but a deep and terrible loneliness. "I did not spare you because you were weak, Vyra. Of the finest warriors I have ever faced, and I have faced things that would make this entire station scream." "Then why?" "Because you reminded me of who I was before the Accord turned me into a weapon. Because when I looked at you in that arena, I saw someone who still believed that fighting could be beautiful, and I did not want to be the one who took that away from you." Vyra stood there beside him, and something shifted inside her, something tectonic and slow and irreversible, like a continent breaking away from a shore. She had come to Crucible Prime believing she was the greatest warrior in the galaxy, and she had met a man who carried a weight she could not imagine, and wore it so quietly that no one even noticed. She did not feel lesser. She felt changed. "Thank you," she said, and the word surprised her as much as it surprised him. "For holding back. and for the advice about my left side. Eric smiled. A real smile. Small and tired, but firm, genuine. And for a moment, he looked like the merchant again, the quiet man with the glass of water who helped strangers in cantinas. Then his communicator chimed, and the smile faded. He looked at the message on the screen, and Vira watched his face change, watched the warmth drain away like water through sand, watched something old and heavy settle behind his eyes. "What is it?" she asked. "Trouble," he said quietly. "Something followed me out of the dead corridor. I thought I had destroyed it, but it seems I was wrong, and it is heading this way." Before she could respond, the station's emergency sirens began to wail, a sound that cut through every wall and every corridor, and every conversation on Crucible Prime, like a blade through silk. And on Observation Deck 7, Eric Stone stared at the stars, with the eyes of a man who had hoped, just once, to rest, and knew that rest was not coming. "It always finds me." The thing that came out of the darkness between the stars did not have a shape that the mind could hold for long. It moved like smoke and struck like a fist, a vast and shifting mass of something that was not quite matter and not quite energy, pulsing with a cold light that hurt the eyes and made the instruments on every ship in sensor range scream warnings in languages their crews had never heard before. The Galactic Accord had given it a name, the Remnant, a leftover weapon from a civilization so old that even its ruins had turned to dust 1,000,000 years ago. It consumed energy the way fire consumes air. Shields, reactors, weapons, engines, anything that generated power became food for the thing, and it was heading for Crucible Prime, with the slow and certain hunger of something that had been patient for a very long time. 200,000 beings on the station learned what fear tasted like, and it tasted like metal and static and the cold certainty that nothing in their experience had prepared them for this. Admiral Kessrin's warship dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, and his first transmission was not a greeting or a tactical briefing. It was a single question on a coded channel that only one person on the station could receive. "Gravemaker, are you operational?" Eric stood in the station's command center, surrounded by panicking officers from a dozen species, and he answered with a voice that cut through the chaos like a knife through noise. "Send me my gear." The crate arrived by emergency shuttle within the hour, a long black unmarked container that required 3 security codes and a biometric scan to open. When the lid hissed back, the officers in the command center went quiet. Inside was not a suit of armor in any way that most species understood the word. It was something closer to a second skin, matte black and covered in a web of faintly glowing lines that pulsed like veins carrying light instead of blood. It was Void Warden combat equipment, designed not for battle against soldiers or armies, but for the kind of threats that existed at the edge of what was known and what was survivable. Eric put it on in silence, and every being in the room watched the transformation happen. The merchant disappeared. The man who ate noodles and read datapads and de-escalated bar fights with quiet words and gentle smiles, that man folded inward like a page being turned, and what emerged was something that made the Draelith guards at the door take an involuntary step backward. Gravemaker stood in the command center of Crucible Prime, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier around him. His gray eyes swept the room with a focus that was no longer gentle, no longer kind. It was the focus of someone who had been made into a weapon by necessity and experience, and the simple, terrible fact that when the galaxy sent its worst, someone had to stand in the way. Vira was there. She had refused to evacuate when the sirens began, and she had ordered her warship to hold position alongside the station's meager defense fleet. She was still bruised from the arena, still shaken by what she had learned, still processing the fact that the quiet human she had mocked in a cantina was the most dangerous individual in the known galaxy. But she was a warrior, And warriors did not run. She stepped forward and met Eric's eyes, and she did not flinch. "My ship and my crew are at your disposal," she said. Eric looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had in the arena, reading everything in a glance, and then he nodded once. "Stay on my flank. Do not hesitate, and guard your left side." It was almost enough to make her laugh. Almost. The battle began when the remnant reached the outer defense perimeter, and it went badly from the first moment. Defense fleet opened fire with everything they had. Plasma batteries, kinetic cannons, energy lances that could cut a warship in half. And the remnant absorbed all of it. Every shot, every beam, every missile that struck the thing was swallowed into its shifting mass and converted into more of itself. And the fleet watched in horror as their weapons made the enemy stronger. Ships began to go dark as the remnant reached out with tendrils of cold light and drained their reactors dry, leaving them drifting and dead in the void like insects caught in a web. Eric watched from a tactical screen aboard Vyra's warship, and while everyone else in the room was shouting or cursing or praying to whatever gods their species believed in, he was thinking. That was the thing about humans that no other species truly understood. Not their endurance, not their stubbornness, not their refusal to die, but the fact that inside every human brain was a machine that never stopped. Solving problems, even when the problem was something that should not exist and could not be killed. "It feeds on directed energy," Eric said, his voice calm and flat and utterly without panic. "Stop shooting at it. Every weapon you fire makes it larger." "Then how do we fight it?" Vyra demanded. "You do not. You buy me time." He explained the plan in 30 seconds, and it was insane. The remnant had a core, a dense point at the center of its shifting mass that served as the anchor for the entire construct. And if that core was destroyed, the weapon would collapse. But the core could not be reached by any external weapon, because the remnant's outer body would absorb any energy that approached it. The core had to be destroyed from the inside. Eric was going to cross open vacuum in his Void Warden suit, enter the remnant's body, fight his way to the center, and kill it from within, using a weapon that did not rely on energy. Physical. Something the remnant could not absorb. "That is suicide," Tolek said from his station, all four hands gripping his console. "It is Tuesday," Eric replied, and no one was entirely sure if he was joking. Vyra positioned her warship at the edge of the remnant's reach and began the most dangerous flying of her career, drawing the construct's attention, dodging its tendrils, pulling it away from the station, and the civilian ships trying to flee. Her crew fought with everything they had, and she commanded them with a ferocity and a precision that made her feel, for the first time since the arena, like herself again. On her tactical display, she watched a single dot, Eric's suit beacon, cross the void between her ship and the remnant. He moved fast, using the wreckage of disabled ships as cover. And when a tendril of cold light swept toward him, he changed direction with a burst from his suit thrusters that would have torn an unenhanced human apart. He reached the remnant's outer surface and did not slow down. He punched through it the way a diver breaks the surface of water. And then he was inside, and Vyra's display showed his vitals spiking as the construct's interior tried to drain the energy from his suit. She watched his heart rate climb, watched his suit power drop from full to 70% to 50 to 30 in less than a minute. And he kept going. Inside the remnant, Eric thought through a landscape that no living being had ever seen. A churning, lightless void filled with structures that moved and shifted and reached for him with appendages made of frozen energy. He did not have time to be afraid, and even if he did, fear was something he had used up a long time ago, in places darker than this. He built his weapon as he moved, pulling components from his suit, from the wreckage of absorbed ships he found floating in the construct's body, from anything solid he could. It was crude. It was ugly. And it was brilliant. A kinetic charge assembled from salvaged parts, designed to deliver a physical impact that the remnant could not absorb, because there was no energy to feed on, only force. He reached the core after what felt like hours, but was actually 7 minutes, and he could barely see it through the damage to his helmet's display and the darkness that pressed in from every side. His suit power was at 4%, his oxygen was running low, and on Vira's tactical display, his heart stopped. The line went flat, and every person on the bridge went still, and Vira felt something crack inside her chest that she would not be able to name for a long time afterward. 3 seconds passed. 4, 5, and then the heartbeat came back, irregular, struggling, but there, because humans did not stop. Humans did not quit. Humans did not have the basic common sense to know when they were supposed to die and stay dead. Eric armed the charge, placed it against the core, and triggered it. The explosion was not large by galactic standards, but it did not need to be. It needed to be precise, and it was, because the man who built it had been solving impossible problems under impossible conditions since he was 17 years old. The core shattered. The remnant collapsed, its vast body losing cohesion all at once, dissolving into a shower of fading light that scattered across the void like snow falling upward into the stars. Crucible Prime was saved. Every surviving ship in the defense fleet was saved. 200,000 beings on the station who had been counting down the minutes to their own deaths were saved. And floating in the wreckage where the remnant had been, tumbling slowly in the silence of space with a suit at 0 power and a heartbeat that had stopped and started twice, was one human. Vira's ship reached him first, went to the airlock herself, and when the recovery team brought him in, broken, burned, barely breathing, his suit cracked open and frost forming on his skin, she carried him. A 7-foot Draelith warrior, the pride of her dominion, 3-time arena champion, carried a broken human through the corridors of Crucible Prime in her arms like something precious, and the crowds that had gathered to watch parted in silence as she passed. No one laughed, no one murmured, no one looked at the small damaged human in the arms of the alien giant and saw anything less than the savior of every life on that station. Eric spent 3 weeks in the medical bay, and Vira visited him every day. They did not talk about the arena. That felt like something from another lifetime, a smaller world where the biggest concern was pride and glory and who was the strongest predator in the room. They talked about other things, about Draelith poetry and human music, about the color of stars and the taste of food on different worlds, about what it meant to be a warrior and whether that meaning could change. On the day Eric was cleared to leave, Vira met him at the medical bay door in her full commander's uniform, her scales polished and her copper eyes bright. "I am returning to the Dominion," she said. "I am going to reform our warrior doctrine, everything about how we train, how we think, how we define strength." "What will you teach them?" Eric asked. "That true strength is not about being the apex predator. It is about being the one who stands when everything else falls." Eric looked at her, and he smiled. The real smile. Not the merchant's mask, not the weapon's cold focus, but the smile of a man who had been alone for a very long time, and had just heard someone say something that made the loneliness a little smaller. "That is the most human thing anyone has ever said to me," he said. "Hand." Eric took it. They stood like that for a moment, the warrior and the weapon, the predator and the human, and then Vira turned and walked away, her tail held high, and her stride carrying a new kind of confidence that had nothing to do with being the biggest, or the fastest, or the deadliest thing in the room. Tolek fell into step beside her as she boarded her ship, and he waited until they had cleared the docking bay before he spoke. "What do you think of humans now, Commander?" Vira stood at the viewport and watched Crucible Prime shrink behind them, and she was quiet for a long time. long enough that Tolek thought she might not answer at all. "I think," she said slowly, her copper eyes reflecting the distant light of 1,000 stars, "that the galaxy is very lucky they are on our side." Far below, in a corridor of Crucible Prime, a man in plain clothes, with calm gray eyes and a faded scar on his neck, sat down at a small table in a cantina, and ordered a glass of water. His communicator buzzed. A new message from Admiral Kesrin. Another crisis, another impossible mission, another dark corner of the galaxy that needed someone to walk into it and make sure nothing walked out. He stared at the message for a long time. Then he finished his water, picked up his bag, and stood. The merchant's mask slid back into place, the quiet smile, the gentle eyes, the unremarkable posture of a man who could have been anyone and no one. Eric Stone walked into the crowd and disappeared. Just another human, lost among the stars. And the galaxy kept turning, never knowing that the quiet man with the glass of water was the reason it was still there to turn at all.